The wind that rolled over Red Creek carried dust, secrets, and the faint cry of coyotes from the far hills. By the time the sun slid low behind the mountains, the little town had already tucked itself into the slow rhythm of twilight. The blacksmith's hammer had gone quiet. The saloon's piano gave its last trembling note, and from the edge of the plains a single rider came into view, his horse moving slow, his hat pulled low, and his coat heavy with trail dust. The people who caught sight of him from their porches didn't know his name, but the older ones, those who'd been around 5 years back, felt something familiar stir in their chests. They remembered a quiet cowboy who once rode away from Red Creek with a broken heart and no plans of ever returning. Now he was back. 5 years had changed him. His face was harder, his voice quieter, his eyes darker. The man who'd once sat silent at the corner table of the saloon, barely speaking, never gambling, never fighting, was gone. In his place was someone who rode with a purpose heavy as lead, and behind him, over the ridge, the first glint of sunlight caught the edge of a long line of riders, men in dust coats and wide-brimmed hats, rifles across their saddles. 500 of them, following him in silence like a shadow army. The townsfolk didn't know whether to wave or hide. 5 years ago, that same man had been the heart of quiet decency, a simple cowboy who worked cattle for the Wilson Ranch, never causing trouble, never asking for more than the land and the sky. He wasn't rich, he wasn't fast with a gun, but folks trusted him. He was the kind who'd mend a neighbor's fence before mending his own, who'd ride 50 miles just to help a friend bury a sick horse. He spoke little, smiled even less, and carried a kind of peace around him that didn't belong to the noise of the frontier. But then, one summer she came, the Apache woman. No one in Red Creek ever agreed on how she'd arrived. Some said she came on foot, walking from the southern ridges after her village had been scattered by soldiers. Others swore she appeared one morning by the river, washing her horse in the shallows, her black hair shining like wet coal. All they knew for certain was that she didn't belong to their world, and yet she didn't seem afraid of it either. She had the kind of beauty that made men stare and women whisper. Not the polished beauty of a rancher's daughter, but something wild, untouched, like the desert before fences. Her eyes held storms, her voice was low, and her words were few. Most of the town didn't speak to her, though they talked plenty about her. But the quiet cowboy, he saw her different. He didn't speak much, and neither did she. Yet somehow they understood each other in the spaces between silence. He'd bring her supplies when others wouldn't, help her trade pelts or lead her horse through the rocky passes. Sometimes they'd sit by the river as the sun went down, saying nothing, just listening to the land breathe. Folks called it foolish. The saloon talk grew sharp, but he didn't care. What no one could figure out was why she turned him away. One night, word spread that he'd asked her to leave with him, to start over somewhere beyond the reach of fences and prejudice, maybe in the high country where no one cared about bloodlines or tribes. But she'd said no. Nobody knew what words passed between them, only that she rode out before dawn, and he followed her tracks until they disappeared in the dry wash. When he came back days later, he didn't say a thing, packed his saddle, quit his job, and left town before the next sunrise. The quiet cowboy who once kept peace with everyone left Red Creek with a heart that no one could fix. Years passed. Seasons turned. The town forgot, as small towns often do. Children grew, fences went up, and Red Creek's name spread as the railroad came closer. But out in the hills, the land still remembered. And when the horizon darkened one October evening with a line of riders stretching farther than the eye could see, the land remembered him too. The old sheriff came out onto his porch, rubbing the dust from his spectacles. He squinted toward the distant figures. "That can't be him," he murmured. But deep down, he knew it was. And when the cowboy finally reached the edge of town, he reined in his horse and looked at the faces gathering by the main road. Faces that once pitied him, then forgot him. He didn't smile, didn't wave. The silence around him felt like a held breath. Behind him, the men waited, 500 strong, each one armed, each one loyal enough to follow him into the kind of trouble few would dare face. "Evenin', Sheriff," he said quietly, his voice steady as a river in winter. The sheriff took a slow step forward. "Evenin', you're riding heavy for a man who used to ride light." The cowboy's gaze shifted toward the hills, the same hills where she'd vanished 5 years before. Things change. There was something behind his eyes. Not anger, not regret. Something else, something colder, more patient. The kind of thing that grows in a man when he's seen too much, lost too much, and finally decides he's done being quiet. Nobody dared ask what brought him back, or why so many men rode with him, but rumor traveled fast. Some said he'd spent the last years working for the army, rounding up outlaws and deserters. Others whispered he'd built his own band of riders, men who owed him debts, men who followed him because he'd saved their lives. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain: he wasn't here for small talk. As night settled over Red Creek, lanterns flickered in windows. The air thickened with dust and unease. Mothers pulled their children inside. The piano in the saloon went silent, and still, the cowboy didn't move. He just sat his horse in the middle of the road, staring toward the dark ridge to the west, the ridge where the Apache woman was last seen. Then, faintly from beyond the hills came the echo of a drum. It was soft, at first like the heartbeat of the earth, but it grew louder, steadier until even the horses pricked their ears. The sheriff turned toward the sound. "That's no cattle drum," he muttered. The cowboy didn't answer. His jaw tightened. He reached slowly for the reins, eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon was rising over the desert. The glow revealed a distant line of figures moving through the sagebrush, silent, graceful, and unmistakable Apache riders, the same people the town thought long gone. For the first time, the quiet cowboy's voice carried a note of something fierce beneath its calm. "5 years ago," he said, "I rode away because she told me to." The sheriff swallowed hard. "And now?" He looked toward the rising moon, where the silhouettes of the riders drew closer and his hand tightened on the saddle horn. "Now," he said quietly, "she's calling me back." The town stood frozen, caught between two forces rolling toward each other through the desert night. The echo of hooves filled the air, mingling with the drumbeats that grew louder, steadier, more alive. And as the cowboy lifted his hat and turned his horse toward the hills, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the same dust, the same secrets, and the same cry of the coyotes that had haunted Red Creek for years. No one knew what was about to happen, but every soul in that town, every child, every old man, every woman clutching her doorway, felt that something bigger than them all was coming. Something that started with love, ended with silence, and was now returning like a storm over the plains. By the time the cowboy spurred his horse forward, and his 500 men followed in unison, the last of the daylight vanished. The drums thundered louder, and Red Creek held its breath. The moonlight spilled across the open plains like a silver river, glinting off every saddle buckle and rifle barrel. The cowboy rode at the front of his men, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats echoing behind him. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that crept into a man's bones and made him remember every hard mile he'd ever ridden. He didn't look back at Red Creek. He didn't have to. He could feel the weight of all those eyes on his back, the townsfolk who once turned away from him now standing silent in their doorways, wondering if they were about to see their world turned upside down. The drums from the hills beat slower now, steadier, almost like a heartbeat calling him forward. He knew that sound. He'd heard it once before, on a night that never left him. The last night he'd seen her. Back then, the drums had come from far off, half swallowed by the wind when the soldiers were closing in on her people. She had stood by her horse, her hair braided tight, eyes full of something fierce and sad all at once. He'd begged her to come with him, to leave the fighting behind, to start somewhere new where no one cared what blood ran in their veins. But she had shaken her head. "You ride your trail," she had said quietly. "I must ride mine." He had never forgotten those words. The sound of the drums now felt like an echo from that night, a message from the past carried on the wind. He wasn't sure what it meant, if it was a warning, a welcome, or a reckoning. Behind him, his men rode in silence. Most were rough-looking, sunburned, and road-tired, but loyal. Some were former ranch hands, others scouts. A few ex-soldiers who'd lost faith in the uniform. He had gathered them over the years one by one, not for war, but for something deeper. A cause none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel. They followed him not because of gold or glory, but because they believed in the quiet strength he carried, the kind that didn't shout, didn't boast, but never broke. "Boss," a man riding close behind him said, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "You sure this is the way? Feels like we're riding straight into ghosts." The cowboy didn't look back. Sometimes ghosts are the only ones who'll tell you the truth. They rode on. The land around them was old, older than fences, older than names. Mesquite trees reached out like dark fingers from the earth, and the hills rose like sleeping giants under the starlight. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound carried long and lonely across the plains. He remembered the first time he'd ridden this way, before everything changed. Back then, Red Creek had been smaller, just a handful of wooden buildings and a church bell that didn't always ring on time. The people were hard but fair, living on cattle, corn, and faith. The war with the tribes had not yet reached their valley, but tension was already in the air like smoke before fire. The settlers spoke in half-whispers about the Apache in the south, stories filled with fear, most of it twisted by ignorance. When the Apache woman first came to town, some folks treated her like a bad omen. But to him she was like a piece of the land itself, untamed, proud, and strong. She didn't bow her head, didn't flinch under stares. She'd walk through the market with quiet dignity, trading pelts and herbs for flour or salt. Sometimes he'd watch her from across the street, noticing how she always carried herself as if she belonged, even when everyone told her otherwise. It wasn't beauty that drew him. It was the calm in her eyes. The same calm that came before a storm. He didn't speak to her for weeks. Then one day he saw her struggling to lead her horse through the muddy crossing near the river. He rode down, offered help. She looked at him long and hard before nodding once. That was how it began, without words, just two souls meeting where the land met the water. For months, they met in quiet places, the riverbank, the foothills, the empty fields at sunset. They shared food, laughter, and the kind of silence that said more than talk ever could. He taught her to mend tack. She taught him the ways of the land, how to read the wind, how to find water where there was none, how to listen to what the earth was saying. Then came that last summer. The soldiers moved closer, pushing her people north. Red Creek filled with tension and talk of raids, though none had come. When she stopped appearing by the river, he rode south until he found her camp. The smoke from burnt tents still hung in the air. She was there, tending to the wounded. When she saw him, she smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried sorrow behind it. "You shouldn't have come," she'd said. "I couldn't stay away." He'd asked her to leave, to start fresh somewhere the past couldn't follow. But she'd turned toward the horizon. A root can't grow if you tear it from the ground. The next morning, she was gone. He'd searched for her until his horse gave out, then kept walking. When he finally returned to Red Creek, there was nothing left in him to stay. He left town that same night, heading wherever the trail led. Now 5 years later, the trail had led him right back to the place where it all began. As he neared the ridge, he could see fires flickering in the distance, small, steady, like stars fallen to earth. Figures moved around them, faint against the glow. The Apache riders who had appeared on the horizon were closer now, though still keeping their distance. He slowed his horse, raising a hand for his men to halt. The wind carried the scent of smoke and sage. Somewhere among those fires, he felt she was near. He couldn't explain how he knew. He just did. One of his men, a grizzled old scout named Dyer, rode up beside him. "You think she's there?" He nodded once. "I know she is," Dyer spat into the dirt. "You reckon she'll welcome us? After all that's gone between your kind and hers?" "She doesn't owe me welcome," he said quietly. "I'm not here for that." "Then what are you here for?" He looked out toward the fires, eyes narrowing. "To finish what I started." The scout frowned but didn't ask more. He'd ridden long enough with the cowboy to know that when he spoke like that, no power on earth could turn him from his path. As the men settled their horses and waited, the night grew still. The drums had stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than sound. Then, from the shadows ahead, a single rider appeared. A woman on a paint horse, her silhouette framed by firelight. Even from a distance, he recognized the way she sat tall in the saddle, calm and proud, the same way she had years ago. His chest tightened. She stopped a few yards away, the moonlight catching the glint of silver in her hair. Her gaze locked with his, unreadable. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You came back," she said finally, her voice low and steady. He nodded. "You called me." Her eyes flickered just for an instant. "Not for this." Behind him, the 500 riders shifted uneasily. The air between the two of them felt thick enough to touch. "I didn't come to fight," he said. "Then why ride with an army?" she asked softly. He looked down at his reins, then back at her. "Because the land's changing, and when it changes, it breaks the people who belong to it. You know that as well as I do." Her gaze softened, but only a little. "What you call change, others call taking." He didn't argue. He just nodded. "Maybe that's why I'm here." For a moment, neither spoke. The night wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Somewhere behind the hills, thunder rolled. The scent of rain drifted on the wind. Finally, she turned her horse slightly, glancing toward the dark horizon. If you came seeking peace, you're late. The world's already chosen its path. He followed her gaze. Then I'll make my own. Before she could answer, a distant shout echoed through the valley. Harsh, panicked, human. Both turned toward the sound. From the north, torches flared against the black sky. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He knew that sound. Soldiers. The woman's hand went to the knife at her belt. "They're coming," she said. He met her eyes again, and for a heartbeat, all the years between them disappeared. "Then we stand together," he said. The drums began again, faster this time, urgent, alive. His men formed up behind him, rifles ready but hearts uncertain. Across the plain, the Apache fires burned brighter, and as the first drops of rain began to fall, the cowboy reached for his hat, pulling it low against the wind. Whatever peace he'd once hoped for was gone. The night ahead would decide what kind of man he had truly become. The storm rolled closer, and the plains trembled beneath the sound of approaching thunder. The rain came slow at first, tapping against saddles and hats like soft fingers. Then it gathered strength, sweeping across the plains in sheets that blurred the horizon and drowned out the sound of the drums. The cowboy sat still in the saddle, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes fixed on the northern ridge where the torches burned. Behind him, his 500 riders formed a line that stretched across the wet land, men waiting, uneasy, listening to thunder and wondering if it was God or gunfire coming their way. The Apache woman hadn't moved. She sat astride her horse like a statue, the wind tugging at her braid, her gaze steady on the same ridge. Between them, the land stretched wide and silent, heavy with all that had been left unsaid. Then faintly came the sound. Horses, many of them. Iron shoes striking wet rock, voices shouting through the storm. Soldiers. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He'd known they'd come sooner or later. The army had been moving west, driving anyone they couldn't control off their land. Settlers, outlaws, natives. It didn't matter much. He'd seen it before. He'd seen the way progress left graves behind it. One of his men rode up beside him, rain streaking his face. "You want us to hold position?" "For now," the cowboy said quietly. "No one fires unless I say." The man nodded, though he didn't look convinced. They'd followed this cowboy through deserts, across border towns, into fights that made no sense at the time, but always came out right. But this was different. This wasn't about gold or cattle. This was something deeper, and no one could quite name what it was. The Apache woman's horse shifted, its hooves sinking in the mud. She looked at him across the rain. "You shouldn't have brought these men." "I didn't bring them for war," he said. "Then what for?" He hesitated, his voice low. "To keep the land from swallowing more people I care about." For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something that wasn't anger, but sorrow. She glanced back at her riders in the distance, then to the lights moving on the ridge. "The land doesn't swallow," she said softly. "It remembers." The wind carried her words away before he could answer. The first of the soldiers appeared through the curtain of rain, gray coats glistening, rifles at their sides. They moved in formation, the way only trained men did, cutting across the plain toward the fires. The lead officer raised a lantern, the light flashing off his wet badge. He called out, voice sharp and commanding. "This territory is under government control. Lay down your arms and disperse." The cowboy didn't move. Neither did his men. The officer's horse snorted uneasy. The man raised his voice again. "Who's in charge here?" The cowboy nudged his horse forward, slow and deliberate. The rain had soaked his coat through, and his face was shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He stopped 10 paces away. "That'd be me." The officer looked him up and down. "You're leading this band?" "They follow their own will," he said calmly. "That's so." The officer's lip curled. "Then you'll tell them to leave this area. You're trespassing on restricted ground. We have orders to clear it." "Whose orders?" the cowboy asked. "Army orders." He nodded slightly. "And who gave the land to the army?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The officer's jaw tightened. "You'd best move along, friend. You're standing between the government and its business." "Business?" The cowboy's voice hardened. "What kind of business burns villages and buries families?" The officer shifted in his saddle, his hand brushing the butt of his pistol. "You're walking a thin line, mister." The Apache woman rode up beside the cowboy, her horse's hooves splashing in the mud. The officer's eyes flicked to her, then narrowed. "You're one of them," he said, the word sharp. She didn't flinch. One of who? He gave a short laugh. You know exactly who. For a moment, no one spoke. Rain pattered against leather and metal. Thunder rolled far off, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. The cowboys' men shifted restlessly, fingers brushing triggers. Across the plain, the Apache riders waited in silence, their faces unreadable. The cowboy finally spoke, his tone low but steady. You'll turn your men back. No one here wants blood tonight. The officer leaned forward in the saddle. You think you can tell the U.S. Army where it can and can't go? I'm telling you where it shouldn't. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then the officer raised his hand. Men, he barked. Ready arms. The sound of metal filled the air, rifles cocking, safeties snapping off. The cowboy didn't move, but his voice cut through the rain like a whip. Don't, his riders froze. They trusted him enough to stop, even with fear in their eyes. The soldiers hesitated too, unsure what they were about to start. For a long moment, it was just rain and thunder between them. Then a single gunshot split the air. No one knew who fired first. Maybe it was a nervous soldier, maybe a frightened horse kicked, maybe fate just decided it was time. The bullet whistled past the cowboy's shoulder and buried itself in the dirt. Everything broke loose. Horses reared. Men shouted. The world erupted in noise and chaos. The cowboy spun his horse around, shouting orders that were half lost to the storm. The Apache riders swept in from the ridge, their cries cutting through the gunfire. Smoke mixed with rain as flashes of light tore through the night. He saw the officer fall from his horse, a shadow in the mud. He saw one of his own men go down, clutching his chest. He rode through it all, trying to make sense of the madness, shouting for his men to fall back, to hold fire. But the noise swallowed his voice. Through the blur of rain and smoke, he saw her, riding through the chaos like a streak of lightning, her braid flying, her face set with fierce calm. She wasn't running. She was leading her people away, guiding them toward higher ground. He kicked his horse and followed, shouting after her. Wait! She didn't look back. Behind him, the gunfire faded as the storm swallowed the sound. His men were scattered. The soldiers, confused and drenched, were retreating toward the ridge. But the damage was done. Blood had hit the earth again, and there was no taking it back. He caught up to her at the edge of the hills. She'd dismounted, standing beneath a twisted oak, her hands trembling though her eyes were steady. You should have stayed away, she said, her voice raw. You think I wanted this? He shouted. You think I came here to start a war? Her gaze met his. It doesn't matter what you wanted. The world's decided for you. He looked around. The wounded, the smoke rising, the flicker of dying fires. The storm was easing, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. He could see his men regrouping in the distance, some carrying the injured, others searching for horses. We can still stop this, he said quietly. If we talk to them, find another way. She shook her head slowly. There is no other way. You can't talk to men who see you as less than dust. The truth of it hit him like a punch. He'd spent years trying to build bridges, trying to make sense of a world that didn't want sense. And now, here he was again, standing between two sides that would never meet halfway. She turned away, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. You should take your men and go, he stepped closer. And leave you? She hesitated, eyes glistening in the fading stormlight. You can't save what's already burning. Before he could answer, a rider galloped up the slope. One of his men, face pale, voice hoarse. They're coming back, he panted. Twice as many. The army's bringing reinforcements. The cowboy looked toward the horizon, where faint lights flickered in the rain. He felt something shift deep inside him then, a slow, heavy realization that whatever this night had begun, it was far from over. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He turned to her one last time. If it's war they want, he said softly, then I reckon the land's gonna remember this night too. She looked at him, the wind tugging her hair across her face. It already does. Below them, thunder rumbled again, not from the sky this time, but from the earth, where hundreds of hooves were already moving. The plains trembled beneath them, and the night grew darker still. Neither spoke another word. They just stood there, side by side, watching the lights approach. Two souls caught between past and future, between mercy and vengeance. As the storm began to rise again, the night carried the smell of smoke and rain. It clung to everything, the earth, the horses, the men who waited in silence on the dark ridge. Down below, Faint torchlight wove through the mist where the soldiers were gathering again, their shouts breaking through the wind. The cowboy stood beside his horse, staring into that distant glow. His coat was torn, his face streaked with mud, but his eyes were steady. He had seen too much to be afraid now. Behind him, his men whispered among themselves. They had lost riders in the earlier fight, and the fear hung heavy between them. Some checked their rifles. Others stared at the ground, trying not to think about what sunrise might bring. The Apache woman stood apart, her figure outlined against the dim light of the campfires. Her people were tending to the wounded, quietly, efficiently, with no wasted words. The old ones murmured prayers in their language. The children clung to their mothers. It wasn't a camp of warriors. It was a camp of survivors, preparing for whatever the dawn would demand. The cowboy walked to where she stood. "They'll come with everything they've got," he said softly. She didn't turn. "They always do. I can still send my men out through the southern pass. They could circle around, cut the soldiers off before they reach the canyon." Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "And when they do, what then? You fight one wave, another will follow. They don't stop, not for reason, not for mercy." He looked toward the horizon, where a faint red glow bled through the rain clouds, campfires or maybe dawn. "You sound like you've already given up." She turned then, eyes sharp, tired but unbroken. "No, I sound like someone who's learned what losing looks like." The words hit him harder than any bullet could. He wanted to argue, to promise that this time would be different, but the lie caught in his throat. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Every battle fought on this land ended the same way. It swallowed the good and the bad alike. Still, he couldn't walk away. "Not again. I made a promise once," he said quietly, "to never let this land take someone I love without standing in the way of it." She looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "And what if standing in the way costs you everything?" "Then I reckon it'll be worth the price." The silence that followed was heavy. The rain had stopped, but the wind carried the low hum of thunder from the distance. The land seemed to hold its breath. One of his men approached, a young rider named Tully, barely 20, his hat too big for his head and his hands shaking as he held a lantern. "Boss," he said, his voice thin. "We scouted the ridge. There's close to 200 soldiers coming through the canyon already. They got wagons and rifles. Looked like they brought a cannon too." The cowboy didn't flinch. "How long?" "Maybe an hour before they reach the flats." The cowboy nodded, dismissing him with a look. When the boy walked away, he turned back to the woman. "If your people move north, they might make it through the cliffs. My men can cover the rear." She shook her head slowly. "You'd be signing your death papers." "Wouldn't be the first time," he said with a faint, tired smile. Her gaze softened, but only a little. "You still think this is about you, don't you? That your death can fix what's broken?" He didn't answer, because maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about fixing anything anymore. Maybe it was just about not letting the world destroy what little was left of what mattered. Lightning flared far off, lighting the plains in a brief silver flash. For that instant, everything was clear. The line of soldiers winding through the valley, the frightened faces around the fires, the wet ground that would soon be soaked in more than rain. He turned to his men and spoke in a low voice that carried through the wind. "We hold the line at the ridge. No one fires first. No one runs. We keep them off the camp as long as we can." There was a murmur of agreement, low and grim. The men moved to their positions, checking rifles, whispering prayers, steadying their horses. The Apache riders moved too, forming a wide arc beyond the camp, their figures blending with the darkness. The woman gave them a few quiet orders, then mounted her horse. Before she rode off, she looked at him once more. "If you survive this," she said, "don't follow me again." He watched her ride into the night, her silhouette vanishing into the mist. Something inside him twisted, but he pushed it down. There wasn't time for what-ifs anymore. The wind shifted, carrying the echo of distant commands. The soldiers were close now. He climbed onto his horse, the leather creaking beneath him. He drew his rifle and took a long breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs. He could hear the steady rhythm of hooves, the clink of bridles, the faint scrape of metal as the soldiers readied their weapons. The world had narrowed to this moment, the ridge, the rain, the heartbeat of the earth beneath them. Then came the flare of light, a single torch tossed high into the air, bursting like fire against the dark sky. A signal. The soldiers advanced. Gunfire cracked across the plains, echoing like thunder. The ridge came alive with flashes of light. Bullets tore through the wet grass, splintering wood and rock. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The cowboy rode forward, shouting orders above the chaos, his rifle steady, his movements sharp and practiced. He could see the officer again, the same one from before, riding hard at the front, shouting for his men to push through. There was fury in that man's face, the kind that came from pride and fear mixed together. The cowboy fired once, his shot grazing the man's arm. The officer jerked but stayed upright, raising his sword and pointing toward the camp. "I advance." The soldiers surged forward. The ridge shook with the force of cannon fire. The first shell landed short, sending dirt and rock flying into the air. The next one struck closer, the explosion lighting up the rain-soaked night like lightning. The cowboy's horse reared, nearly throwing him. He steadied it, heart pounding. "Tully!" he shouted. "Fall back to the left flank. Keep the horses covered." The young rider nodded, fear in his eyes but obedience in his bones. He turned his horse and rode hard, calling for the others. The cowboy looked down the ridge and saw the Apache riders moving in, swift and silent, their arrows cutting through the night. They struck fast, vanishing before the soldiers could return fire. But for every enemy they dropped, 2 more took their place. The cowboy reloaded, his hands steady despite the shaking ground. He felt the old rhythm return, the one he'd thought he'd left behind years ago, the part of him that had always known how to survive. He fired again and again, the rifle kicking against his shoulder, the sound ringing in his ears until he couldn't tell gunfire from thunder anymore. Then, through the smoke, he saw her again. She was fighting at the edge of the camp, her movements quick, precise, fearless. But she was outnumbered. 3 soldiers had broken through the line, closing in fast. He didn't think. He spurred his horse down the slope, firing as he rode. The shots scattered the men, but one lunged toward her. She turned, striking back with the butt of her rifle. The man fell, but not before his blade caught her shoulder. The cowboy reached her side just in time, pulling her up onto his horse. She tried to protest, but her strength was fading. "You fool," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Wouldn't be the first time," he said, his voice rough. He rode hard toward the ridge, the rain stinging his face, bullets whizzing past. Behind them, the soldiers regrouped, pressing forward with renewed force. They reached a narrow rise where the rocks offered cover. He dismounted, helping her down gently. "You need a medic," he said, glancing at her wound. She shook her head. "Save your concern. Worry about your men." He looked around. The fight was spreading, the lines breaking apart. His men were retreating toward the upper slope. The Apache were falling back too, pulling their wounded. The soldiers kept coming, their numbers endless. The sky flashed white again. Another cannon blast roared through the night, closer this time. The ground shook beneath them and the shockwave threw him off balance. When the dust cleared, he could see the soldiers advancing through the smoke, their shadows long and ghost-like. The cowboy clenched his jaw, gripping his rifle tighter. He could feel the moment closing in, the point where everything would break. The woman beside him steadied herself against the rock, her breathing shallow but her eyes fierce. "If we fall tonight," she said quietly, "make sure they remember who we were." He looked at her, rain running down his face, and for a moment everything, the war, the loss, the years, fell away. There was only her, and the land that had both blessed and cursed them. Then came another flare of light from the valley below. A signal. The soldiers began to move faster. The cowboy raised his rifle, heart pounding. The storm broke again, the sky roaring above them, and the ridge was swallowed by fire and thunder as the battle reached its peak. The night had come alive, and it wasn't done with them yet. The dawn came slow, pale and quiet, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. The storm had passed, leaving the valley wrapped in mist and smoke. The ridge that had once roared with gunfire now stood still, littered with broken rifles, torn saddles, and the quiet forms of men who would never ride again. The air smelled of ash and wet earth, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind through the grass. The cowboy sat on the ground beside a burned-out wagon, his hat resting on his knee. His coat was torn, and his arm was bound with a strip of cloth dark with blood. He didn't know how long he'd been sitting there, minutes, maybe hours. Time had stopped meaning anything the moment the shooting ended. A few of his men were still alive. He could see them moving among the fallen, helping who they could, whispering the names of those they couldn't. Tully was there too, limping, his hat gone, his face streaked with soot. When he saw the cowboy, he walked over and crouched beside him. They pulled back, Tully said quietly. Soldiers retreated just before sunrise. Guess they had enough. The cowboy nodded. How many did we lose? Tully looked away. Too many. The words hit hard, though he already knew the answer. They always lost too many. What about the Apache? The cowboy asked. Tully hesitated. They're gone. Slipped north before dawn, took their wounded with them. The cowboy stared out across the valley. The mist was lifting now, and the land looked different, quieter, older, like it had seen this all before and would see it again. She go with them? Tully nodded. Last I saw, she was still in the saddle, hurt, but alive. The cowboy's jaw tightened, and he looked down at the dirt between his boots. Relief and sorrow tangled in his chest. He wanted to believe she'd make it, that she'd find peace somewhere the world couldn't reach her. But part of him knew she'd always be running, from soldiers, from ghosts, from everything that tried to take her freedom. For a long while, neither man spoke. The sun climbed higher, turning the smoke into gold. The wind carried the faint smell of wild sage and pine from the hills. Life was still here, stubborn as ever. Tully broke the silence first. What now, boss? The cowboy looked at the horizon, where the plains stretched out forever. We bury the dead, he said. Then we ride home. They worked through the day, digging graves under the shade of a ridge oak. They marked the spots with small stones, carving initials where they could remember them. There were no speeches, no prayers, just quiet work, and the heavy sound of shovels meeting earth. By evening, the sky had turned soft and pink. The men packed their saddlebags and prepared to leave the battlefield behind. The cowboy took one last look around before mounting his horse. He didn't say anything. There were no words big enough for what they'd seen. The ride back was slow. The land seemed endless, each mile heavier than the one before. They stopped only when night fell, camping near a shallow stream. The fire crackled weakly, its light reflecting in tired faces. Tully sat across from him, chewing on a piece of jerky. You think she'll come back? The cowboy didn't look up. No, he said simply. Guess she's got her own road to ride, Tully muttered. The cowboy nodded. We all do. He stared into the fire for a long time, watching the sparks rise and vanish into the dark. Her face came to him then, the calm strength in her eyes, the way she spoke without fear, even when death was close enough to touch. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again. Maybe that was the point. Some people weren't meant to be kept. They were meant to be remembered. When morning came, they rode again. By the third day, the land began to soften, turning from stone and dust to grass and wildflowers. The air smelled cleaner. In the distance, smoke curled from a chimney. Their town, small and stubborn as ever, still standing on the edge of nowhere. As they rode through the main street, people came out of their homes. The blacksmith set down his hammer. The baker's wife pressed a hand to her mouth. The children ran out barefoot, calling for their fathers, hoping to see familiar faces. The cowboy dismounted slowly. The townsfolk watched him, waiting. He didn't have the heart to tell them everything, but they saw enough in his eyes. Some cried quietly, others simply nodded, accepting the truth the way frontier folk always did, with silence and endurance. By evening, the town was quiet again. The men who had returned sat in the saloon, drinking to the ones who hadn't. The piano stayed still in the corner. No songs tonight. The cowboy stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing against his face. The stars were out, bright and clear. He could hear the faint rustle of the cottonwoods by the creek, the same sound he'd grown up with. But the peace didn't feel the same. It never did after a fight like that. He walked down to the edge of town, where the hills opened wide. The grass swayed in the moonlight, silver and endless. Somewhere out there, he knew. She was riding north, through forests and canyons, across land that didn't belong to anyone but the wind. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a feather, tied with a thin leather cord. She had given it to him the night before the battle, pressing it into his hand without a word. He turned it over now, feeling the worn texture beneath his fingers. She's still out there, he murmured to himself. And that's enough. The wind answered, soft and low, carrying the scent of the plains. Weeks passed. The town began to heal. The graves outside the church grew grass. The children played again in the dust. The cowboy went back to his ranch, fixing fences, tending horses, mending what he could. The world didn't stop for grief. It just kept turning, slow and stubborn. Every so often, travelers passed through. They'd bring stories from the north, rumors of a band of Apache who'd vanished into the mountains, living quiet, far from the reach of soldiers. Some said a woman led them, fierce and wise, with eyes like storm clouds and a heart that never bent. He'd listen without saying a word. But when they left, he'd go out to the porch and watch the horizon, the same old longing sitting heavy in his chest. He didn't need to chase her anymore. He just needed to know she'd made it. One evening, when the sun was setting over the ridge, his daughters came riding up the trail. They were older now, stronger, their laughter echoing through the valley. They'd been away helping kin in another town, and seeing them now filled the air with warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. They ran to him, arms around his neck, and for a moment, the years of loss and worry melted away. "Pa," one of them said, smiling through tears. "You look tired." He chuckled softly. "Ain't that the truth?" As they sat on the porch together, the youngest looked out toward the hills. "Do you think she's still out there? The Apache woman?" He paused, his eyes on the fading light. "Yeah," he said finally. "Somewhere out there she's watching the same sunset we are." They fell quiet, listening to the evening sounds, the crickets, the creak of the old barn, the wind through the grass. The sky turned gold, then purple. The land stretched wide and forgiving. The war was over, but the memory of it lingered, like dust that never quite settled. The cowboy took off his hat and let the breeze touch his face. "The world keeps changing," he said softly. "But some things, they stay." His daughters leaned against him, the warmth of family grounding him in the fading light. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called, a lonely sound, yet full of life. The cowboy smiled faintly. He had lost much, but he had learned something too. That the heart can heal, even after the hardest battles, if it keeps beating for what's right. The night fell over the plains, wrapping everything in quiet peace, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the land had forgiven them all.